Hello, Socialist Links here. Um, there's an absolute, I guess like there's an absolute there's an absolute misconception about the party or the Vanguard Party entirely that leaves a lot of people essentially having very bad interpretations of it, and then essentially arguing positions that essentially strawman a lot of other people's positions, and essentially don't have I guess a clear understanding of the entire conversation and have already made up their mind instead of actually listening to other people that they're discussing with, and basically they just leave them on blank. And when they essentially go read Lenin, the person that essentially hypholized or and argued for the Vanguard Party the most, they essentially already think that the Vanguard Party already substitutes over the working class, which is very much false. Um, and yet we still have people like this, and yet we still have people that essentially kind of make these arguments, which is very much problematic, and thus it is a absolute cancer. It is an absolute it's a bankruptcy of revolution. It's a bankruptcy of revolutionary activity and revolutionary understanding. And it sucks that essentially we have this debate still. With this video, I hope to actually address some things about a comrade of mine, a very close comrade of mine, but that goes by the name of Jackie Roving, who has essentially argued this and argued essentially against the position of the Vanguard Party without actually understanding me, and essentially has recently made a quote-unquote detailed response to me and my positions. As I'm gonna point out here, I'm gonna basically break down all of these quote-unquote details and actually show that he's lacking in actual details and actually lacking in actual information. And with so especially when I've been trying to actually talk with him, but he's essentially taken everything I said over his head, and now he's essentially made a response to me. This video is going to go unlisted. This is probably going to be shared only with Jackie Roving. But if I am tempted to do so, I will essentially have to make this public, if possibly. I will essentially have to publish this public. But yeah, without further ado, let's get started. We see here that Lenin makes a distinction between the Bolsheviks and the class-conscious representatives of the mass of the working class, of the working people. Along makes it clear that the Bolsheviks stand above the class-conscious representatives of the working masses. If the Bolsheviks were made of the representatives of the working class of Russia, then there would be no distinction between the Bolshevik and the class-conscious representatives, nor would be stand above the class-conscious representatives of the working masses, for the leadership implies either a position above someone, authority over someone, and or subordinate to someone. This is absolutely embarrassing, especially when he provides the quote that he essentially gave, and he makes such a response like this. It is absolutely embarrassing that he essentially suggests that this entire thing is true. And since he's quoting Lenin here, let's actually quote what he's actually saying from Lenin. In Lenin's immediate task of the Soviet government, he says, a fundamental condition of the successful accomplishment of the primary task of organization confronting us is the people's political leaders, i.e., the members of the Russian Communist Party, Bolsheviks, and following them, all the class-conscious representatives of the mass working people, shall fully appreciate radical distinction in this respect between previous bourgeois revolutions and the present socialist revolution. Vladimir Lenin, the immediate task of the Soviet government. This is the quote that Jackie Roving refers to when essentially trying to quote-unquote make the distinction between even the Bolsheviks and the class-conscious proletariat. But reality, when you actually see the Bolsheviks and the following them all the class-conscious representatives of the mass working people, you can see he makes no comma. He makes no parentheses. He makes no two dot followings as should. He only makes a comma in the end. Shall fully appreciate the radical distinction. Thus, he does not make the distinction. Rather, when he uses following them, he is referring to the appreciation for the radical change of the Soviet government. That is what Lenin is essentially saying here. I can understand how someone can come to this conclusion, but then again, when people use following, it usually comes with a comma or yeah, uh, two dot symbol in which that is actually what they mean by the following. I mean, this is how writing essentially works, and Lenin, he is very messy with his words, but you can still understand him on what he's saying. And it's very clear on what Lenin is saying here. He's not making the distinction between the class conscious of the working class, but he's essentially seeing that the class conscious of the working class are still workers and are essentially held by the workers themselves. Thus, you can't necessarily even say that this party is in the subordinate of the proletariat when the entirety of the proletariat subordinates the party entirely because of the fact that it is controlled by the proletariat, which leads us to his next paragraph and his next argument. Furthermore, if you tell me that the Bolsheviks are workers too, then you can throw every theory of state capitalism out the window and be blind to the problem plaguing socialism since the conception, because you fail to understand how given ways of organizing can replace the very issues with we see to the capitalist society today in the workplace or whatnot, along the fact that you fail to see how conflicts and issues can not only arise from the thing which workers exist in relation to, but within the ranks of the workers themselves. See the conflict between workers and intellectuals. This is another very much big misunderstanding. It is very much entirely a reduction of an argument to something that is essentially not even being made, nor is something that could even be considered entirely relevant. Especially when the fact that, when we talk about party organizing, we essentially talk about in cerebral, and we talk about it within the entire revolutionary organizing to actually make a worker state in the first place. That is when we talk about revolutionary organizing and the goals for a revolutionary party and building up class consciousness and political consciousness to the working class. Not necessarily of people leading the revolution, but really educating the revolution and having the educated masses themselves then lead the revolution. The masses themselves within that party format. That is what we talk about as vanguardists, as actual vanguardists. If you essentially understand Lenin and understand what Lenin is essentially saying when he argues for his positions entirely. It is absolutely embarrassing that I have to point out this to Roving over and over again, despite the fact how many times I've pointed this out and how many times I've even presented quotes from not only Lenin, but presented quotes from Marx, Engels, and like both of them on the question of the entire party organization, on the question of what to do with an uneven and economic political development of the working class, and the fact that they still argue this entire position. This is absolutely just intellectually dishonest, and they've already essentially made up their mind. And every point that they essentially you can make would go over his head. It is absolutely barbaric, and it's absolutely chaotic. The fact that he's even still making this argument. I'm gonna end it once and for all with a few quotes from Lenin himself, and then we can move on to what Marx can say about consciousness and what he would also later say about party organization. In Fear for the Collapse of Tile Old and the Fight for the Tile New, Lenin says, like all true friends of the oppressed class, we can only derive satisfaction from the exploiters' extreme measures of resistance, because we do not expect the proletariat to mature for power in an atmosphere of cajoling and persecution. In a school of merely sermonious and didactic declamations, but in the school of life and struggle. To become the ruling class and defeat the bourgeoisie for good, the proletariat must be schooled, because the skill this implies does not come ready-made. The proletariat must do its learning in the struggle of the stubborn, desperate struggle in the earnest of the only meal teacher. The greater extremes of the exploiters' resistance, and the more vigorously, firmly, ruthlessly, successfully will they be suppressed by the exploited. it is very much clear here that Lenin is not calling for the entirety of the leadership over the proletariat, nor is he calling for the Bolsheviks, nor is he calling for any party to lead the entire of the working class to revolution. Rather, the fact that he's calling entirely for the development of class and political consciousness to the proletariat, in which the workers themselves can then get organized into the party that educates them through democracy, through centralization of that format, of the centralization of their Soviets, of the organic organizations that they made into that party, and essentially can have democratic discussion, debate, vote on policy, vote on discussions, and make a lot of these formats a reality for revolutionary activity. To even understand this, we can even look to the Proletarian Revolution and Renegade Kautsky, where he actually criticizes Kautsky in his substitutionism and into his bureaucratic tendencies. The Soviets are a direct organization of the working and exploited people themselves, which helps them organize, the administer, and the own state in every possible way. And this it is the vanguard of the working and exploited people, the urban proletariat that enjoys the advantage of being the best united large enterprises. It is easier for all others to elect and exercise control over those elected. The Soviet form of the organization automatically helps unite the working and exploited people around the vanguard, the proletariat. Note how he essentially makes a comma of the vanguard, where he makes the vanguard entirely being the proletariat. Anyways, the old bourgeois apparatus, the bureaucracy, the privileges of wealth, the bourgeois education of social connections, etc. These real privileges are the more varied, more highly bourgeois democracies developed. All this disappears under the Soviet form of organization. Vladimir Lenin, the Proletarian Revolution, and Renegade Kautsky. As I said before, note how he essentially makes the comma of the proletariat also with the vanguard, implying that the vanguard does mean the entirety of the proletariat, for the fact that the proletariat did organize under the vanguard, and how that was organized was through Soviets essentially being formed in that structure through democratic debate, through electing policy, and then electing other people to present that policy, and having those elections to be recallable as much as possible for that democratic organization, i.e. power to the working class and the entirety of organization of the working class by the workers themselves. This is the theory of revolution. This is an oppressed class themselves rising up against the oppressor class. That is revolution, my friend. And you are trying to discourage that entirely, especially when there's nothing to essentially debunk here. Lenin makes it very clear he is not substituting over the workers, and he's never hoped to dream of that after he broke with Kautsky. He has never tried to do as so. He's never essentially had any desire to do so. Nor did any Soviet government, even after the revolution took place, was there any formations to do so in the first place, until in 1921 and 22, when there was the centralization of Soviets without a background direct check for the entirety of the working class to actually make that effective effort, and then essentially prolong the centralization of Soviets in the government institution itself. That was what led to the entirety of the bureaucracy. The fact of the prolongation of the centralization of Soviets and the entirety of the ban on factions, and the fact that that happened in the first place. You know why? Through federalization, not centralization, federalization. Believe it or not, the Soviet Union was actually becoming more and more federalized after the Civil War, and actually was becoming more and more decentralized furthermore, and essentially decentralized power from each section, from Stalin and away from the central government, that the central government controlled by the entirety of the proletariat. Thus, entirely, what we can understand here is the fact that when we cause this bureaucracy, and when bureaucracy is caused within the Soviet Union, as you always try and say, is really the problem of federalization within it. Believe it or not, this is actually very much true. I'll even provide sources in the link in the description below that actually talk about this subject. Without further ado, though, let's actually talk about Marx and the relation of consciousness and what he learned about the Belgian Revolution entirely, and how we can actually stray from this. Or how we cannot stray from this, but how we can learn from this, and how we can actually understand the absolute importance of educating the working class. In Karl Marx's work on the freedom of the press, he says, quote, "No one with any historical education will deny the separation of Belgium from Holland, an incomparably greater historical event than their union. The press in Holland is said to have brought about the Belgian Revolution. Which press, the progressive or the reactionary? It is a question which we can also raise in France. If the speaker blames critical Belgian press, the satirical Belgian press, which at the same time was democratic, he should also blame the serial press in France, which at the same time was absolutist. Both helped to overthrow their governments. In France, it was not freedom of the press, but censorship that made for revolution. But leaving this out of account, the Belgian Revolution appeared at first as a spiritual revolution, as a revolution of the press. The assertion that the press caused the Belgian Revolution has no sense beyond that. But is that the matter for blame? Must the revolution at once assume a material form? Strike instead of speaking? The government can materialize a spiritual revolution. A material revolution must first spiritualize the government. The Belgian Revolution is a product of the Belgian spirit. So the press, too, the freest manifestation of the spirit in our day, has its share of the Belgian Revolution. The Belgian press would not have been the Belgian press if it had stood aloof from the revolution, but equally the Belgian Revolution would have not have been Belgium if it had not been in the same time a revolution of the press. The revolution of a people is total that each sphere carries out on it in its own way. Why not also the press as the press? Karl Marx, on the freedom of the press. It is clear here that Marx is very much implying that there is entirely of a need for entirely of consciousness to the entirety of the population of itself through that. Because of the fact, looking at the Belgian Revolution, he's able to come to that conclusion that the entirety of what caused the Belgian Revolution was the fact that there was entirely of education, the fact that there was political thought, there was entirely free discussion, there was free debate, and there was entirely of a class conscious of the people's conditions in which they essentially uprose in their own numbers against the entirety of the state and essentially formed their own new government. This is entirely what we can understand here, and this is what Karl Marx is trying to imply here when essentially looking at the press, that the fact that there is a need for a class conscious and political development, for the fact that the entirety of the proletariat cannot essentially just become class conscious and politically conscious through pure spontaneity or through pure struggle, rather through the entirety of class consciousness among themselves, among the entirety of the people, helping them through camaraderie, i.e. entirely of advanced working class people who are class and politically conscious, helping the rest of the working class, i.e. the entirety of the point for the Vanguard Party in the first place, as listed in the previous two quotes from Lenin. This is entirely of the praxis here, and this is entirely what is needed, that Marx himself analyzed and saw a problem for, and did see, yes, there is a political and economic political and economic development of the working class, and this needed to be fixed. Even in the relation of the workers and the intellectuals, you are failing to understand that the intellectuals can be workers themselves. You're failing to understand that entirely. And then you reduce this entirely to, if that being true, then this entirely rejects state capitalism, which I'll get into later. But with that, I'll actually quote Marx again when he essentially talks about political indifference, when he talks about the anarchists and essentially his disagreements with them, and especially where he actually does talk about organization. This brings us to the oracle of these doctors of social science, M. Proudhon. While the master had the courage to declare himself energetically opposed to all economic activities, and combination strikes, etc., which contracted his repetitive theories of mutualism, and the same time, through his rise to the personal participation, he encouraged the working class movement and his disciples to not dare declare themselves openly against it. As early as 1847, when the master's great work, The System of Economic Contradictions, had just appeared, I refuted this sophisms against the working class movement. Nonetheless, in 1864, after the law of Vieille, which which granted French workers, in a very restrictive fashion, a certain right of the combination of Proudhon returned to the charge in a book, The Political Capacities of the Working Class, published in a few days after his death. The master structures were so much of the taste of the bourgeoisie that the Times, on the occasion of the great tailors' strike in London in 1866, did Proudhon honor, translating him and condemning the strikes with the master's very words. Here are some selections. The miners, Riviere de Guerre, went on strike, and the soldiers were called in to bring them back to reason. Proudhon cries, the authority which had miners Riviere de Guerre shot acted disgracefully, but in the acting of the Brutus of the old caught between the paternal love of the consular duty, it was necessary sacrifice his sons to save the republic. Brutus did not hesitate, and positively dare not condemn him. In all memory of the proletariat, there is no record of a bourgeois who has hesitated to sacrifice his workers to save his interests. What Brutus of the bourgeois must then be. Karl Marx, Political Indifferentism. It is already clear here that there is now then a need for organization and then need of a class conscience for the proletariat when revolution is to come, to one, essentially make a revolution in the first place and actually have the working class commit to revolutionary action, and two, not to essentially allow absolute spontaneous and absolute chaotic violence for no apparent reason that will essentially not get anything done and will not actually create a worker state, and rather just create a chaotic mess of people randomly killing each other everywhere. Hence the entire of the reasons why Marxists are opposed to individual terrorism. Because of this reason, actually. Because of the fact that you can't just essentially rely on a few individuals to entirely make the revolution, or essentially rely on yourself for that revolution. Rather, it is you yourself among with others built up together and struggling together entirely for that revolutionary goal in a collective manner, in a collectivist understanding. That is the theory of revolution that Marx is essentially trying to describe here, that Lenin entirely tries to describe as well, with the entire the relation of the Vanguard Party, as we essentially went on last time. Now, then to address onto state capitalism, on how this essentially rejects state capitalism. This is absolute reductionism. This is absolute, irrelevant reductionism that makes no entire sense for the entire discussion that we're having. Having a theory of revolution and trying to organize a revolution has nothing to do with when analyzing the entirety of state capitalism, of the fact that there is the social relation of capitalism controlled by the state, or essentially has massive entire say from the state itself, with the social relation of capitalism entirely, that is massive controlled commodity production, massively focused commodity production, absolute generalization of the market exchange, the absolute use of money, the entirety of traditional circulation to the rest of the entirety of the population of money, etc., etc. All this not rather controlled by the bourgeoisie or by the workers, just by the state itself entirely, that acts as that ruling class body, thus creates an abstract class in a way, which makes state capitalism. This has nothing to do with the theory of revolution when the working class is trying to smash that entire state machine in the first place and is trying to destroy that entirely. That is the entire things that we can understand here, and yet you basically reduce this to the theory of state capitalism, that we should just reject this with this being true. This is absolutely redundant. This is absolutely. How do you even come up with this? How do you even come to that conclusion entirely? That's my question. How do you even come to that conclusion? It absolutely makes no sense. It has no relation within each other. It's not relative between each other, and it's completely different entirely to the subject. We both agree the Soviet Union was state capitalist. There's absolute evidence for that. But you can't just essentially reduce that then for someone to reject an actual practical means for revolution to then reduce it that you should then reject state capitalism. That is an absolute unrelated reduction to the entire discussion at hand. Jackie Roving, I must ask, why do you essentially go on this entire reduction when it is not interrelation between the two? It makes no sense at all. It absolutely makes no sense. it's an absolute embarrassment of calling yourself a Marxist. Honestly, it's an absolute embarrassment of that. With that in mind, I think we already addressed that entire thing already too much. Anyways, I already provided a lot of quotes. I already provided a lot of arguments towards you, Jackie Roving, and towards the entirety of the audience. Very little of the audience that might be watching this in the first place. But yeah, I've already addressed the entirety of the arguments. Let's continue to what he says next. I'm also suspicious of Lenin's account of the Russian Revolution and how it unfolds, since historical figures have things and beliefs which color and or distort their understanding of the historical events unfold. So relying on Lenin as a source without secondary sources to back up his accounts of those historical events is dumb. Saying that in advance. This is absolutely horrendous, and this shows the entirety of the embarrassment that is Jackie Roving not thinking as a Marxist entirely in the first place. With this entire statement in mind, you can then essentially condemn Karl Marx's account of the Paris Commune entirely in this instance, because of the fact that you essentially, be suspicious of them and be suspicious of their entire historical account. Because of the fact that Marx essentially, talks about what happened in the Paris Commune, but does not essentially would go into full detail apparently, and especially when he himself is a Marxist and essentially defends the Paris Commune in every respect, and thus would essentially want to characterize it as a brave and as a very brave working class revolution by the workers themselves. And this is what the Paris Commune was. However, what was actually left unmentioned in the Civil War in France, believe it or not, was the fact that there still exist actually firms, and the fact that there still actually technically existed, firms and the entirety of accumulation of capital in the Paris Commune. There is still private firms essentially being used, and the only difference now is the fact that there was just controlled by the workers rather than the entire full abolition of that. Marx never mentioned this in the Civil War in France, however. But it is entirely a secondary account that many people essentially accounted for and essentially talked about that did essentially happen. Nevertheless, it is still a very important aspect. It is still a very important event, and it is very much important to actually understand this. This is why I essentially would source Lenin when I'm essentially talking about the Russian Revolution. Because one, he was literally there. Two, he was the guy that essentially got the whole thing running. And and his entire account is still very much useful to what we can understand the importance of such a revolution and such a mass movement entirely, and what we can understand from that as for a revolutionary activity. And the fact that you, Jackie Roving, essentially reduce Lenin to being a very much bad figure, authoritarian figure in every respect, is absolutely dumbfounding, and actually shows that you have no idea entirely the theories for revolution at all that Lenin is essentially trying to discuss here, that essentially Marx himself tried to talk about as well, which you always ignore. It is absolutely horrendous that I even have to make this video, and that you even have to make, and that you're even having the entire sheer desire to even make your detailed response, when in reality you're leaving out the sheer details that is needed within this debate. It's absolutely horrendous, honestly. Here we see issues in Lenin's language. Lenin says, by creating a new Soviet type state, referring to the Soviet Socialist Republic, which gives the working and oppressed people the chance and take advantage of the part of the independent, building up the new society, we solved only a small part of this difficult problem. Lenin makes it beautifully clear beforehand, such a revolution can be successfully carried out only when the majority of the population, and primarily the majority of the working people, engage in the independent creative work as makers of history. This means the workers only can carry out a successful revolution if they have the control over their own lives, organized on their own terms, and doing away with the things that impede the workers' ability to decide in their distinctions and engage in the individual social activity. With that fact in mind, we see in part in this quote of Lenin says, by creating a new Soviet type of state, which gives the working and oppressed people the chance of take an active part in the independent building up of a new society, we solved only a small part of this difficult problem. Lenin does not say the Soviet socialist state Soviet Socialist Republic, assures the guarantees the workers their own hands. They take part in the management of the affairs of society, rather than the Soviet Socialist Republic gives them a chance. This could be safely interpreted to mean sense of the current conditions of Russia, allow the workers the opportunity to take control of their own lives. But another interpretation could be that the workers give the opportunity to do such things by the Bolsheviks, which would be Lenin contradicting himself. For the sake of consistency, we're turning to the stronger position. We choose the former interpretation over the latter. The former interpretation is the entirety the correct one. The latter interpretation is absolutely a misinterpretation by far. In this response, I actually agree with him. I agree. The entirety of the revolution is carried out by the workers themselves. This is very much obvious. Lenin does not disagree. No vanguardists, no practical vanguardists within the Trotskyist position, especially the entirety of the people that I essentially refer to when essentially taking into the vanguard, that essentially take in that factor, which is the international socialist tendency. People like Tony Cliff, Duncan Hollis, Alex Kalinikos, John Molyneux, Chris Harman, etc., etc. All these people, they agree. The working class themselves carry out revolution. No one disagrees on this. But you're essentially coming to a strawman position that then this essentially rejects the Vanguard Party. When the fact that, as I pointed out beforehand, and as well as what we can essentially understand of the Vanguard Party, that Lenin essentially ascribed to, that I always keep pointing out to you, that the Vanguard Party is entirely controlled by the proletariat themselves. It is indeed controlled by the proletariat after the fact that they have been educated within class and political consciousness. Especially in this system, when the entirety of the worker state has already been established, the workers themselves, then have that control and then smash that state machine. This isn't the entire theory of the entirety of the worker state and the entire theory for revolution in the first place. This is what it means to be a vanguardist, or to be an actual vanguardist. And when you read Lenin after he broke with Kautsky, the Bolsheviks is the party which governs over Russia. We still have yet to see the clarification that the Bolsheviks were given such governing power by the workers, and even if Lenin were to clarify later on, then there would need to be proof as to how, in what context. Okay, this is actually very frustrating for me because this shows that he actually has never entirely effectively understood, and effectively read Lenin and the basics of Leninism in the first place. He has never entirely even understood the entire basics of Lenin and entirely what it means to have a vanguard party in the first place. And as already presented from the entire the Proletarian Revolution, Renegade Kautsky, this entire vanguard party is entirely limited by the proletariat themselves and essentially subjected to the proletariat, by the proletariat, for the proletariat. It is the power of the working class after they have been educated entirely. And the fact that he still asks this question as if so is absolutely mind-blowing to me, because of the fact that I always point this out to him, yet he essentially always comes to this conclusion later on. As I always say, every discussion you entirely make with him about the Vanguard, it will go over his head. For some reason. I don't know why, but it just goes over his head for no apparent reason. Anyways, let's actually quote Lenin then, and actually give Jackie Roving a proof of this entirely being true. We have the following of the majority of a class of the vanguard of the revolution, the vanguard of the people, which is capable of carrying the masses with it. We have the following, the majority of the people, because Cherov's resignation, but while by no means the only symptom, the almost striking and obvious symptom of the peasants, will not most receive the land of the socialist revolutionaries bloc, or from the socialist revolutionaries themselves, and that is the chief reason for the popular character of the revolution. Vladimir Lenin, Marxism and Insurrection. Here we already see that Vladimir Lenin essentially already says that the entirety of how the revolution was able to keep going and how the Bolsheviks was able to actually take in power was the fact that it was done by the masses themselves, was the fact that the entirety of the proletariat joined in mass organization, in mass, entirely where there was entire revolutionary activity. In fact, the entirety of the Bolsheviks grew in a large membership during the entirety of October, during the entirety of April, when Lenin got back and was actually debating entirely of discussing people and essentially bringing class and political consciousness to the entirety of the proletariat and essentially educating them on revolutionary theory and essentially giving slogans to the entirety of the proletariat that the proletariat makes themselves and then join within the party and then made their own programs into that with Soviet power in that factor and then bring more Soviets into that in which almost all Soviets were in the entirety of the Bolshevik organization, as Lenin had pointed out beforehand. Thus, entirely, this is how the Bolsheviks were able to get into power, was the fact that it was controlled by the entirety of the masses themselves. Again, we can even look forward to even another quote from Lenin entirely with the theories of the Vanguard Party and what that entirely means from the masses themselves. In Can the Bolsheviks Retain State Power? Vladimir Lenin says, if anybody asserts the question of the Bolsheviks alone taking over all full state power is totally infeasible political question that only a swilled-headed fanatic of the worst kind can regard as feasible, we refute the assertion that quoting the exact statements of the most responsible and most influential political trends of various hues. Roving. But let me begin with a word or two about the first and two questions mentioned. Will the Bolsheviks dare take over the full state alone? I have already had occasion at the All-Russia Congress of Soviets to answer this question of the affirmative, uncertain manner by a remark that I shouted from my seat during the Teresli's Mistral speeches. And I have not met in the press or heard of the statements by the Bolsheviks to effect we ought to take power alone. I still maintain that a political party, and the party of the advanced class in particular, would have no right to exist, would be unworthy for the name of party, would be non-entity in any sense, if we refuse to take power when opportunity offers. We shall now quote statements of the cadet socialist revolutionaries and semi-Bolsheviks, I prefer the quarter Bolsheviks, on the question that asserts us. Vladimir Lenin, can the Bolsheviks retain state power? The vanguard would take state power and smash the state machine. That would seem as a one-party state, sure, but here's the problem with that analysis. It's not considering that the working class are in control of the party, that the workers have Soviets in the party, that they are centralized under the party and use Soviets to elect leaders after they have democratically discussed what they would likely to do and what voted on, and came to what they want. The leaders and chairs they elect into the party have to present what they advocated for into the central committee of the party, which is basically the grouping of chairs into the party that members elect themselves. This is the entire common practice of democratic centralism. By allowing the party, it adopts the will of the proletariat by the proletariat's hands and resolutions, in which it can be acted on, put into place, and acted upon for revolutionary action. Now, if the party were to take over this and seize state power, then institute this system with the state that smashes the state machine alongside the formations of the proletarian militia when the standing army and police force is abolished. Thus, it's not the party dictatorship, rather a proletarian dictatorship. In other words, it is not the entirety of the party smashing the state machine in reality, rather it is the fact that the workers still smash the state machine. In fact, I'll say this when this actually gets important later on in this video. This was the entirety of the power for the Bolsheviks at hand, was the fact that it was controlled by the workers themselves, for the workers, and by the entirety of the hands of the working class, in that relation between workers to other workers for class and political consciousness. That is the entire theory of the Vanguard Party, and what we can understand from that. And what we can even understand from Alex Kalinikos, actually, in his entire essay called The Soviet Power, in his reference to the Russian Revolution, he even talks about this, which I'll even quote again. Again, you should probably read it. It's actually a very good book that essentially gives a secondary account for the Russian Revolution and what happened with the Bolsheviks. Anyways, let's see what Alex Kalinikos has to say. The thrust forward came consistently from below. It was the new working class, the women of the charitable, of the Cheromshi, who took in the initiative during the February Revolution and the July days, catching the Bolshevik Party unawares. But in October, the Bolsheviks were able to catalyze and energize the aspirations of the united class as a seizure of power. The Bolshevik Revolution then arose of the radicalization of the Russian working class within the process of production itself. The factory committees, the Soviets emerged to give radicalization the organized expression which culminated in establishment of working class power. But the radicalization of the proletariat under conditions of war production was not confined to Russia alone. Every major imperialist country passed through the same experience. In order to meet the needs of the war effort, each of the belligerent governments intervened on the large scale in the economy, imposing rationing and conscription of labor, taking over and setting up key firms, banning strikes. They received the assistance of the leaders of the traditional workers' organizations, of the social democratic parties, and trade unions. Across Europe, social peace was proclaimed as the leaders of the workers' movement eagerly involved themselves in the collaboration with the government and the employers and the contribution to slaughter. The expansion of the mass production undermined the position of the skilled craftsmen, creating a mass new layers of unskilled and semi-skilled workers drawn from among the women from the countryside. Within the process of production itself, workers were subjected to military discipline backed by the state and their own trade union leaders, while prices and profits rocketed. The result of a stormy revolutionary movement which swept across Europe at the end of the First World War. It began in Russia in February 1917, which followed the mass strikes of the centralized Berlins of April 1917, and January and 1918, strikes by 200,000 British engineering workers in May 1917, and the mass uprising in Turin in August of 1917, and culminating points of Europe-wide movement were October Revolution itself, the German Revolution in November 1918, and overturned the Kaiser and led to the situation of dual power and the occupation of the factories in Italy in September 1920. At the century of the explosion of all explosions was the metal industry, engineering, steel, shipbuilding. Throughout Europe, and the industry, the transformative impact of the war economy is a vital and role in munitions production. The skilled craftsmen in the industry, turners, fitters, etc., found their traditional privileges threatened by the techniques of the mass production, which made skills redundant, reduced, and the traditional over their workforce of the mass of skilled, semi-skilled laborers. Management exploded situation to launch the assault power which the skilled workers had to build up and back the unions through a variety of devices. The Treasury Agreement in Britain, the committees of the Industrial Mobilization in Italy, and the War Industries committees in Russia. Alex Kalinikos, Soviet power. So there you go, Rowling. That is your entire proof of how the Bolsheviks are actually able to, be a party of the working class. And this is actually very important when you go on this entire argument again and again furthermore, which is very much annoying, honestly. Anyways, let's continue. This is a change in attitude from Lenin, which contradicts his original attitude of self-emancipation of the working class. Rather than the workers beginning the leader of the new administration of the new way of life, we see it is now the party that is now handling the administration along with convicting the people, which he said previously that the majority of them took this side of the Bolsheviks. We also understand the party is now the working class, but something which exists in relation to the working class, along with the fact Lenin has yet to explain the detail of the Bolsheviks were able to win such a majority of the worker onto the side of the party, the vague notion of convicting them. As even you can even see there, if you are a Leninist and if you are a practical Leninist and have read Lenin on a lot of his works and do agree with the Vanguard Party, is the fact that it does not lead the working class, rather it's the working class themselves organized, then you essentially understand that he just answered his own question. It's not the fact that the entirety of the leadership of this party is then essentially leads the proletariat and has like this new administration over the workers, rather the fact that it is the workers themselves. Roving, you just answered your own question. It is the workers themselves. You literally just answered your own question, as I always keep trying to bring up to you over and over again. And you just essentially answered your own question, alongside with the explanation of that from me, when essentially providing quotes from Lenin. This is absolutely embarrassing, Roving. How do you call yourself a Marxist? Ask yourself, how do you call yourself a Marxist? Jesus. Lenin is posting cringe. We go from self-emancipation of the workers to the Socialist Party conquest for power and suppression of the exploiters. As if the Socialist Party, rather than the workers, can overthrow the fighting of the suppressors. Lenin is now talking about the revolution from the working masses perspective, but rather the perspective of the Socialist Party. He also places the achievement of destruction of the ongoing destruction of the ruling class onto the Socialist Party rather than the workers themselves. This is absolutely embarrassing, Roving. You are just showing to me and everyone watching this video that you have never read State and Revolution, or that you've essentially read State and Revolution, but have essentially taken out the entire importance of that. The very basic work of Vladimir Lenin, State and Revolution. You are clearly showing you have never taken the actual important account of organization that Lenin has to say. This is absolutely embarrassing, Roving. You are embarrassing yourself right now. You are just showing to me and almost everybody here that you've never read the basics of Lenin. I'm sorry, but this is true. And I'm going to end it right here and now with a quote from State and Revolution from Vladimir Lenin that explains this entire situation. In State and Revolution, Vladimir Lenin says, quote, "The theory of class struggle applied by Marx to the question of the state and the socialist revolution leads to the matter, of course, the recognition of political rule of the proletariat, of its dictatorship, i.e. of undivided power directly backed by the armed force of the people. The overthrow of the bourgeoisie can be achieved not only from the proletariat becoming the ruling class capable of crushing the inevitable and desperate resistance of the bourgeoisie and of organizing the working and exploited people for the new economic system. The proletariat needs state power, a centralized organization of force and organization of violence, both to crush the resistance of the exploiters and to relieve the enormous of the mass population of the peasant and petty bourgeoisie, semi-proletarians in the work of organizing a socialist economy. By educating the Workers' Party, Marxism educates the vanguard of the proletariat, capable of assuming and leading the whole people to socialism, of directing of organizing the new system, of being the teacher, the guide, the leader of the working and exploited people, in organizing the social life without the bourgeoisie against the without the bourgeoisie and against the bourgeoisie. By contrast, the opportunism which prevails trains the members of the Workers' Party, the representatives of the better paid workers, who lose touch with the masses, get along fairly under capitalism, and sell their birthright for a mass pottage, i.e. the renounce of the revolutionary leaders of the people against the bourgeoisie. Marxist theory of the state, i.e. the proletariat organizing the ruling class, is inseparably bound up with this whole doctrine, the revolutionary rule of the proletariat in history, and the combination of the rule of the proletarian dictatorship, the political rule of the proletariat. Vladimir Lenin, The State and Revolution. It is already clear here that what Vladimir Lenin is trying to say here is the fact that the proletariat, when we essentially mean by the party taking state power, is the fact that the proletariat does entirely lead the revolution themselves and have that control themselves, and then they themselves smash the state machine that has that entire vanguard organization in which they control it in order to make it a vanguard in the first place. Also in State Revolution, Vladimir Lenin says, but from this capitalist democracy that is inevitability, narrow and steadily pushes aside the poor, therefore hypocritical, and falls through and through, forward the development of not proceed simply, directly and smoothly towards greater and greater democracy, as the liberal professors and petty bourgeois opportunists would have us believe. No forward development, i.e. development towards communism, proceeds through the dictatorship of the proletariat, and cannot do otherwise, for the resistance of the capitalist exploiters cannot be broken by anyone else or in any other way. And the dictatorship of the proletariat, i.e. the organization of the vanguard, the oppressed and as the ruling class for the purpose of suppressing the oppressors cannot result merely in the expansion of democracy. Simultaneously with the immense expansion of democracy, which is the first time becomes democracy for the poor, democracy for the people, and not democracy for the moneybags. The dictatorship of the proletariat imposes a series of restrictions on freedom of the oppressors, the exploiters, the capitals. We must suppress in order to free humanity from wage slavery. Their resistance must be crushed by force, and it's clear that there is no freedom and no democracy where there is suppression and where there is violence. Vladimir Lenin, The State and Revolution. Vladimir Lenin here is also essentially relating this of the dictatorship of the proletariat as the fact that this is controlled by the workers themselves for that revolutionary organization. And this is in chapter 5. And beforehand, he even explains on what he'll essentially mean by this, which I'll even quote from Vladimir Lenin's State and Revolution again. In the same work, Vladimir Lenin says, "We are not utopians. We do not dream of dispensing at once of the all administration with all subordination. These anarchist dreams, based upon the incomprehension of the tasks of the proletarian dictatorship, are totally alien to Marxism. As a matter of fact, serve only to postpone the socialist revolution until people are different. No, we want the socialist revolution with people as they are now, with people who cannot dispense subordination, control, and foremen and accountants. The subordination, however, must be to the armed vanguard of the exploited and the working people, i.e., to the proletariat." Note how he essentially talks about the vanguard with the proletariat. Anyways, a beginning must be made at once, overnight, to replace the specific bossing of the state officials, of the simple functions of the foremen and accountants. Functions are already fully within the ability of the average town dweller and can be performed for working men's wages. We, the workers, shall organize large-scale production on the basis of what capitalism has already created, relying on their own experience as workers, establishing strict iron discipline backed up by the state power of the armed workers. We shall reduce the role of the state officials of simply carrying out the instructions responsible, revocable, and modesty paid foremen and the accountants, of course, with the aid of the technicians of all sorts of types and degrees. This is our proletarian task. This is what we must start with in accomplishing the proletarian revolution. Such a beginning on the basis of large-scale production will of itself gradual withering away of all bureaucracy and the gradual creation of an order without inverted commas, an order bearing no similarity to wage slavery, an order under the functions of control, accounting, becoming more and more simple. It will be performed by each turn and will become a habit. Will die out in the special functions of a special section of the population. Vladimir Lenin, The State and Revolution. It is already clear enough that the entirety of what Vladimir Lenin entirely talks about here is the fact that the working class themselves essentially organize these functions, and the working class does essentially have their control on the means of production, and does have the control on the state, and does smash the state machine, and has almost every control in every aspect of the revolution, of the revolutionary government, and of the revolutionary state. That is the dictatorship of the proletariat. Hence, the reason why it is a dictatorship of the proletariat in the first place. To reject this is by far a buffoon and by far an absolute un-Marxist entire analysis of Russia, the entirety of the formations for that. Of course, you can try and say, oh, well, the Vanguard Party is not supposed to really have the seized political power. It's supposed to be the proletariat themselves. Again, the proletariat does this themselves, but you can also claim, well, Marx never talks about this. Hence, this is only a Leninist position. To that, I'll actually quote some works from Engels, and then we can go to Marx in order to actually go to an effective reasoning on why us Marxists should support the vanguard in the first place. So, here we go. Here, we shall quote actually where Frederick Engels does point out that there is an uneven and economic and political development within the proletariat all over the entire world. Here, where he says in Outlines of a Critique of Political Economy, he says, of course, these commercial upheavals confirm the law, confirm it exclusively, but in a manner different from that which the economists would have us believe to the case. What are What are, we think, the law which could assert itself through the periodic upheavals? It is certainly a natural law based on the unconsciousness of the participants. If the producers, as such, were to knew how much the consumers required, if they were to organize production, if they were to share it out amongst themselves, then the fluctuations of the competition and its tendency to crisis would be impossible. Carry on production consciously as human beings, not as disparate atoms without consciousness of your species, and you have overcome this artificial and untenable antithesis. But as long as you continue to produce the present unconscious, thoughtless manner, the mercy of chance, for just so long, trade crisis will remain, and each successive crisis is bound to become more universal than, therefore, worse than the preceding one. It is bound to the impoverished and larger body of small capitals, and to the augment of the increasing proportion of the numbers of the class who live by labor alone, thus considerably enlarging the mass of labor employed on the major problem of our economists, and finally causing the social revolution such as never been and dreamt in philosophy of economists. Friedrich Engels, Outlines of the Critique of Political Economy. Here he even says that the entirety of the point to get to revolution is the fact that we essentially had to develop consciousness to the workers. Now, let's actually see exactly in full detail of what he means by here. To that, we would actually have to go to Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Germany, that was written by Friedrich Engels. In here, he says, now insurrection is an art quite as much as war or any other, and is subject to certain rules of proceeding, which, when neglected, will produce a ruin of the party neglecting them. Those rules, logical deductions from the nature of the parties and the circumstances one has to deal with such a case, and so plain, simple, and the short of the experience of 1848 had made Germans pretty well acquainted with them. Firstly, never play the insurrection unless if you are fully prepared for the consequences of your play. Insurrection is a calculus with very indefinite magnitudes, the value of which may change every day, and the forces imposed to you have the advantage of organization, discipline, habitual authority. Unless if you bring the strong odds against them, you are defeated and ruined. Secondly, the insurrectionary career, once entered upon, act with the greatest determination, and on the offensive. The defensive in the death is the death of every armed uprising. It is the loss before it measures itself with its enemies. Surprise your antagonists while their forces are scattering. Prepare new successes, however small, but daily. Keep up the moral ascendancy, which the first successful rising has given you, and rally those vacillating elements to your side, which always follow the strongest impulse, and which always look out for the safer side, and force your enemies to retreat before they can collect their strength against you. In the words of Danton, the greatest master of revolutionary policy yet known, de lais, and co de lais. Friedrich Engels, Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Germany. In fact, in the same work, he even says, even before this quote, that there is actually a need for then a organization to actually seize power based on this power of the working class themselves, in order to smash the state machine, in order to make that revolution entirely permanent. Here is that quote. The inevitable conflict between the National Assembly of Frankfurt and the states of the governments of Germany last broke out in open hostilities during the first days of May 1849. The Austrian deputies, recalled by their government, had already left the assembly and returned home, with the exception of a few members of the left, or Democratic Party. The great body of the conservative members, aware that the turns against things were about to take, and withdrew even before the called upon so by their respective governments. Thus, in every independently cause, the forging letters have been shown the strength and influence of the left, and the mere desertion in their posts of members of the right. Suffice to turn the minority into a majority of the assembly. The new majority, which at no former time had dreamed ever obtaining in the good fortune, and had profited in their places of the opposition benches to the spout against weaknesses in the indecision and the indolence of the old majority and of its imperial lieutenancy. Now, all at once, they were called into replace that old majority. They were now to show that they could perform, of course, their career as to be one of energy, determination, activity. They, the elite of Germany, would soon be able to drive onwards and senile the lieutenant of the empire and his vacillating ministers, and in case of the impossible, there could be no doubt about it, by force of the sovereign right of the people dispose the opponent government and replace it by an energetic, invariable executive, who would assure the salvation of Germany. Poor fellows, their rule, if rule can be named, where no one obeyed, there is still a more ridiculous affair than even the rule of the predecessors. Friedrich Engels, Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Germany. He even goes on this factor on the Prussian military question in his entire address to the International Working Men's Association. Let's quote that now. In attempting a critique of the military of the military situation in question, we can only proceed from the actual condition facing us. As long as the present conditions persist in Germany and Europe, we cannot expect the Prussian government to act with any other interests in mind than those of Prussia herself. Nowhere can we seriously expect the bourgeois opposition to proceed from any other standpoint than of its own bourgeois interests. The Workers' Party, which in all questions that at issue between reaction and the bourgeoisie stands outside the actual conflict, enjoys the advantage of being able to treat questions quite cold-bloodedly and impartially. It alone treat them sufficiently and historically, as true were already the past automatically, as though they were already corpses. Friedrich Engels, the Prussian military question. It is clear here that essentially Engels is supporting for a workers' organization to entirely talk with the entire of the working class. But Friedrich Engels didn't just get this out of nowhere. This was actually something that Marx himself essentially advocated for, which I will now go on and essentially quote and entirely prove my point as of so. We're actually going to start chronologically, so we're actually going to start in the manifesto itself before the prefaces came about, and then we'll get to the prefaces in the end, and then we'll get to, I believe, the prefaces in the end. So let's get started. The communists are distinguished from the other working class parties by this only: 1. In the national struggles of the proletarians of the different countries, they point out and bring in front of the common interest of the entire proletariat independently of all nationality. 2. In the various stages of development which the struggle of the working class against the bourgeoisie has passed through, they always and everywhere represent the interests of the movement as a whole. The communists, therefore, are on the one hand practically and the most advanced and resolute section of the working class parties of every country, that section which pushes forward all others. On the other hand, theoretically, they have over a great mass of the proletariat in the advantage of clearly understanding the line of marching conditions and the ultimate general results of the proletarian movement. The immediate aim of the communists is the same as that of all other proletarian parties: formation of the proletariat into a class and overthrow the bourgeois supremacy, conquest of political power by the proletariat. End quote. Karl Marx, The Manifesto of the Communist Party. He continues, but you say we destroy the most hallowed of relations when we replace home education by social. And your education is not that also social, determined by the social conditions under which you educate the intervention, direct or indirect, of society by means of schools. And C. The communists have not invented the intervention of society in education. They do but seek to alter the character of intervention and rescue the education from the influence of the ruling class. The bourgeois claptrap about the family and education hollowed correlation of the parents and the child becomes all the more disgusting, and the more by action of modern industry and the family ties among the proletarians of the torn Ulster and their children transformed into the simple articles and commerce of the instruments of labor. But you, communists, would introduce community of women, screams, and the bourgeoisie in chorus. The bourgeois sees his wife as a mere instrument of production. He hears that the instruments of production are too exploited in common, and naturally can come no other conclusion than that the lot of being common to all will likewise fall to the women. He was not. He has not even. He has not even a suspicion that the real point aimed as it is to do away with the status of women as instruments of production. For the rest, nothing more than the ridiculous virtuous inundation of the bourgeois, a community of women, which pretend the openly, officially established by the communists. The communists have no need to introduce community of women. It has existed almost from time immemorable. Karl Marx, the Manifesto of the Communist Party. He continues again with, but whatever form they may have taken, in the fact that it is common of all past ages, viz., the exploitation of one part of society by the other. No wonder, then, the social consciousness of past ages, despite the multiplicity of the variety and displays, moved in the certain common forms of the general ideas, which cannot completely vanish except this total disappearance of class antagonisms. The communist revolution is the most radical rupture of the transitional property relations. No wonder that the development involved in the radical rupture with transitional ideas. But let us have done with the bourgeois objections to communism. We have seen above, and the first step of the revolution by the working class is to raise the proletariat, the position of the ruling class, winning in the battle of democracy. The proletariat will use the political supremacy and to the rest of by degree of all capital from the bourgeoisie and centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state, i.e. of the proletariat organized as the ruling class, and to increase the total productive forces as rapidly as possible. Karl Marx, the Manifesto of the Communist Party. Now, it is fair much to say that there is entirely a lot of things that the Manifesto of the Communist Party talks about that has essentially changed in conditions for, because of the fact of the adaptation of the material conditions, and because of the adaptation of, well, what has happened historically has happened with the revolutions of 1848 and the Paris Commune, and various other workers' revolutions in Russia, actually, during the February Revolution, or the original February Revolution in around the 1880s. I forgot exactly what time that is, but, around there. And that is very much true. In fact, that is very much true. In fact, Marx himself even says in the first preface of the manifesto that he wrote the manifesto with Frederick Engels before the revolutions of 1848. And some of the things that have been said have been antiquated. So that is very much true. However, to that, I would essentially add to what Karl Marx essentially talked about in Theories of Revolution in his March address to the Central Committee of the Communist League. But these demands can in no way satisfy the party of the proletariat, while the democratic petty bourgeois want to bring the revolution to an end as quickly as possible, and achieving at most of the aims already mentioned in our interest and our task to make the revolution permanent until all the more or less property classes have been driven from their ruling positions, until the proletariat has conquered state power, and until the association of proletarians has progressed significantly far, not only in one country, but in all the leading countries of the world. That competition between the proletarians in these countries ceases, and at least the decisive forces of production are concentrated into the hands of the workers. Our concern cannot be simply to modify private property, but to abolish it, not to hush up class antagonisms, but to abolish classes, not to improve the existing society, but to found a new one. Karl Marx, address to the Central Committee of the Communist League. He continues, quote, although the German workers cannot come to power and achieve the realization of their class interests without passing through a protected revolutionary development, this time they can, at least by a certain act of approaching revolutionary drama, will concede to the direct victory of their own class in France, and will thereby be accelerated. But they themselves must contribute onto the most of their final victory by the political position as soon as possible, by not allowing themselves to mislead by the hypocritical phases of the democratic petty bourgeoisie into doubting for 1 minute of the necessity of an independently organized party of the proletariat. Their battle cry must be the permanent revolution. Karl Marx, address to the Central Committee of the Communist League. And this entirely was written in I believe 1851. I can actually check right now. Yep, 1850, March of 1850. So this was actually written very much, in the March address of the Central Committee of the Communist League in 1850. And this was essentially happened after the revolutions of 1848, and in relation to the revolutions of 1848, calling for the revolution to be permanent until capitalism is defeated by the workers themselves entirely through the liberal revolutions that essentially took place all over Europe. Thus entirely comes to the entire principle in mind after the Communist League had disbanded, and entirely the foundation of the International Working Men's Association that Karl Marx essentially gave an inaugural address to, an inaugural speech on the fact, where he even talks about revolutionary organization as well. Here we can quote Marx. At the same time, the experience of the period from 1848 to 1864 has proved beyond doubt that, however excellent in principle and however useful in practice, cooperative labor, if kept within the narrow circle of the casual efforts of private workmen, will never be able to arrest the growth of geometrical progression of monopoly, to free the masses, nor even to precipitately lighten the burden of their ministries. In perhaps the very reason the plausible noblemen of the philanthropic middle-class spouters, and even in the political economists once turned anonymously into the complementary to the very cooperative labor system they had vainly tried to nip in the bud, by deriding the utopia dreamer of the stigmatizing and the sacrifice of the socialist. The safe industrious masses cooperative labor ought to devote the national dimensions of the consequently and the fostered of the national means. Yet the lords in land, the lords of capital, will always have a political privileges over the defiance of the propagation of their economic monopolies. So far promoting, they will continue and lay every possible independent impediment in the way of the emancipation of labor. Remember the sneer with which last session Lord Mostrias, Polymastrian, put down and advocated for the Irish Tenants' Right Bill. The House of Commons cried, "He has a house of landed proprietors to conquer political power, has therefore become the great duty of the working classes." They seem to have comprehended this for England, Germany, Italy, and France. There have taken the places of simultaneous rivals and simultaneous efforts being made the political organization of the working men's party. One element of success they poses numbers, but numbers of the balance if only united combination led by knowledge. Past experience has shown that they have disregard of the bond of the brotherhood which ought to exist between the working men of different countries, and incite them into the stand firmly in the other, into their struggles of emancipation, and chastise of the common discomfiture of the incoherent efforts and thought promoted by working men of different countries assembled on September 28, 1864, in public meeting at St. Martin's Hall, and the founder of the International Association. Karl Marx, inaugural address of the International Working Men's Association. He continues, "If the emancipation of the working class requires their fraternal courserance, how are they to fulfill the great mission of the foreign policy to pursuit of criminal designs and playing upon the national prejudices, a squandering of the parental wars of the people's blood and treasure? It was not the wisdom of the ruling classes, the heroic resistance to their criminal folly, and the working classes of England that saved the west of Europe from plunging and headlong into the infamous crusade of the perpetuation and the propagation of slavery on the other side of the Atlantic." Karl Marx, inaugural address of the International Working Men's Association. So it's very much even clear here in the inaugural address of the 1864 that Karl Marx was actually a firm believer into the entirety of the revolutionary organizing. Sorry about that, my friend. DVD player, external DVD player. Anyways, so it is very much already clear here that the working class entirely does, like, according to Marx, does entirely need a workers' revolution, does indeed need the workers' party entirely within that relation to the workers' revolution as well, as of a way to spread class and political consciousness entirely within that relation, controlled by the workers themselves, in which they can seize political power and smash the state machine. Of course, you can claim this was actually written in 1864, thus before the Paris Commune, which is very much fair. And to that, I would actually write this is actually where we actually get to the point where this is around the time period of the Paris Commune and after the Paris Commune. And we can actually start with Marx's letter to F. Bolt. Here in Marx's letter, he says, quote, on the other hand, however, every movement in which the working class comes out as a class against the ruling class and attempts to force them into pressure without is a political movement. For instance, the attempt of the particular factory, the particular industry, to force a shorter working day out of the capitalists by strikes, etc., is a purely economic movement. On the other hand, the movement to force the 8-hour workday, etc., law is a political movement. And in this way, out of the separate economic movements of the workers grow up everywhere a political movement, that is to say, a movement of the class, the object of the achieving its interest of the general form posing the general social force of compulsion, if their movements of a certain degree, previous organization themselves equally means the development of this organization. Where the working class is not yet far enough in the advance in its organization, undertake a decisive campaign against the collective power, i.e., the political power of the ruling classes. It must, at any rate, be trained in the continual agitation against the hostile attitude towards the policy of the ruling classes. Otherwise, it will remain a plaything in their hands, as the September Revolution in France showed, and as also proved up certain point of the game Mrs. Gladstone and Co. are bringing off in England, even up to the present time. Karl Marx, Marx to F. Bolt, 1871. In fact, in this same letter, he actually criticizes Bakunin for his entire denunciation of a workers' organization and denunciation of such an organization being made into the international formation. So, but I'm not going to provide that because I honestly think this video has been prolonged entirely long enough. So I'm really going to try and end it here, or try to. So today we're actually going to quote after Bakunin has actually been exiled and after Bakunin has actually been essentially voted out of the International Working Men's Association, where we can actually find the resolutions of the First International within this, after essentially kicking out the entirety of the anarchists that were essentially plotting against the international organization. Here is that quote. In persistence of the unbridled reaction, when violently crushes every effort at emancipation on the part of the working men, pretends to maintain the brute force of the distinction of classes and political domination property classes resulting from it, considering that against this collective power, property classes, the working classes, cannot act as a class except by constituting itself into a political party, distinct from all opposed and the old parties formed into propertied classes. That is, the constitution of the working class into a political party is inseparable in order to ensure the triumph of the social revolution and ultimate end of the abolition of classes, that the combination of forces which the working classes already affected by the economical struggles ought to the same time serve as a lever of struggles against the political power of landlords and capitalists. The conference recalls the members of the International. That is, the militant state of the working class, its economical movement of the political action is indissolubly united. Karl Marx, Resolution of the London Congress, 1871. In fact, Karl Marx even recalls this entire resolution and essentially comes to multiple conclusions from this in his actually debate against the anarchists that has split away to form the Alliance of Social Democracy. This is what he says. The first phase of the proletariat struggle against the bourgeoisie is marked by the sectarian movement. In the logical, at the time, the proletariat has not yet developed sufficiently to act as a class. Certain thinkers criticize social antagonisms and suggest the fantastic solutions thereof which the mass of the workers is left to accept, preach, and put into practice. The sects formed by the insulations of the abstentionist by their very nature, i.e., alien to the real action, politics, strikes, coalitions, or in a word, to any united movement. The mass of the proletariat always remains indifferent, or even hostile to their propaganda. The Paris and Lyon workers did not want the Saint-Simonists, the Fourierists, and the Icarians any more than the Cherists and the English trade unionists wanted the Owenists. These sects act as levers in the movement of the beginning, but to become an obstruction as soon as the movement outgrows them, after which they became revolutionary. Witness the sects in France and England, and lately the Lassallians in Germany, who after having hindered the proletariat's organization for several years, ended up becoming the instruments of the police. To sum up, we have here the infancy of the proletarian movement and the astrology of the economy on the infancy of the science. If the International founded the necessity of the proletariat go through this phase. Karl Marx, fictitious splits in the International. It is already clear here that Karl Marx entirely disagreed with Bakunin and did have conflicts with the anarchists on the question of organization, and did see a need actually for organization after the entirety of the failures of the Paris Commune, after the entirety of the crushing of the Paris Commune. And this is very much even said. Not only this, but this is actually something that was even written, even using the terms the vanguard entirely, after seeing the February Revolution in Russia and how it went down and how it entirely failed in time. Not necessarily through the vanguard, but really through actually the lack of it in a lot of cases that Karl Marx essentially talks about. Here is actually that preface that I'm talking about. And now, Russia, during the revolution of 1848 to 49, not only to the European princes, but the European bourgeois as well found their salvation in the proletariat just at the beginning of the awakened Russian intervention. The Tsar was proclaimed the chief of the European reaction. Today, he's the prisoner of war in Klachina, and Russia forms the vanguard of revolutionary action in Europe. The Communist Manifesto had as its object the proclamation of the inevitable pending dissolution of modern bourgeois property. But in Russia, we find face to face with the rapidly flowering capital swindle of the bourgeois property in just the beginning and the half land owned in common by the peasants. Now the question is, can the Russian obligina, though greatly undermined, form the primal common ownership of land passed directly from higher form of the communist common ownership, or the contrary, in the first through the same process of the dissolution and constitutes of the historical evolution of the West. The only answer to that possible today, this is, the Russian Revolution becomes the single proletarian revolution in the West, so that both complement each other. The present Russian common ownership of land may serve the starting point for a communist development. Karl Marx, 1882, preface to the Russian edition of the Communist Manifesto. So, one conclusion entirely that we can make from this entire video, which I just let Marx, Engels, and Lenin essentially try and just make themselves, is the fact that we essentially do need entire revolutionary action and do need entire revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat, and the fact that that does have to come through a centralized organization that talks to the entire of the working class from an advanced working class area, i.e. the Vanguard Party, that actually has those formations in hand. So that way we can actually create an effective revolution. Anyways, that's all for today. Thank you for watching this video. I think I'm not even gonna put any end things on here. I'm probably just gonna put a subscribe thing right there. Plus, I'm pretty sure there's gonna be an originally unlisted video anyways, so it might not even come up on your radar unless it does on my server. Whatever. Anyways, Socialist Links is out.